And I also like having people on the show that are inspiring. And my great find this week, for me personally, was the Free Speech Union and Jonathan Ayling, who joins me now. Jonathan, good afternoon.
Rodney, good to sit down with you again.
Well, I are a huge fan of you and your union. I thought it was very smart, you forming a union, because that allows you to have meetings at universities because you're meeting with workers, even though the universities think that you're a, quote, bad union and therefore shouldn't be allowed, even though they admit you on. You told us when you're on earlier this week about the poor mortician working in a New Zealand hospital who misgendered a cadaver and is in danger of losing his or her job. Has there been any update on that?
Correct. I will be sitting down with the HR department of that individual in question tomorrow, so we may have an update for our members later in the week on that. But I'm pretty confident that they have no basis to compel the speech of this mortician, particularly not towards dead individuals. So hopefully...
are we allowed to know the sex of the cadaver?
I've been asked to keep the details of this hush.
Fair enough.
So I'm not going to go into that anymore. But the basic premise of, I don't think employers have any space going around telling their people what to think on such crucial matters as this, and where they're not dealing with a live person whose opinions have to be taken into account. I think they're really overstepping the mark here.
Yeah. Let's get down. We're going to cover off. I think it's you. When I had you on, I felt bad because you were so great, and we got so carried away. And you wanted to tell us, I believe, about NetSafe and what they're doing with Facebook and Google and all the rest of it. And I had to cut you off because we covered so much. And I want to deal with this today because that's going to affect everyone because, like it or not, you're all involved in Facebook, you're all involved in Google and how they operate. They, even if you're not on Facebook, are still affecting your world. Now, but before we do, could I just cover off a little bit? And I'm not meaning to be critical or anything. I just wanted to explore it. What's your conception of free speech? Which is to say, are there limits on free speech, legitimate limits on free speech in your world?
Absolutely, of course there are. So by no means does the Free Speech Union go around saying anyone can say anything at any time. That's not what free speech means. I'm glad you asked that question, Rodney, because I think it's really important that we understand this, and only then can we understand what a powerful tool free speech really is for peace and stability in our nation. And so we respect that absolutely there are limitations on speech. Things like defamation or slander, and certainly incitement to violence, are very objective standards. Slander and defamation are very established in the court that they are not subjective in any ways. The work that we do, though, relates to the opposition to speech that is purely subjective. And that's what's on the rise at the moment around terms like hate speech or harmful speech. Again, we do not deny in any way that there is hate speech in the country and that it is very problematic, that it does harm people. But we just think we need to be really careful with these terms that are very subjective, that what you define as hate could be totally different to what I define as hate. What one individual defines as harmful could vary significantly from what someone else defines as harmful. And so these terms
just
are often...
slow down, Jonathan. I am with you all the way. So we have defamation, so I can't tell lies about you, which impugns your good name and character, and costs you money and standing in the community. And there's a legal process and a legal standard that you get held to. And that is essentially, I guess, there's no doubt a Defamation Act, but that's a long-standing tort that you're damaging someone. And then we have the idea that you can't say speech that is harmful, and this indeed was well spelled out by John Stuart Mill in his classic On Liberty. And the idea here is I can't stand in a theatre, a crowded theatre, and yell out fire and cause a stampede where people get injured. Because while I haven't injured the people directly, by my actions and by my words, I've caused them to be injured, correct? I've caused the harm. And the Free Speech Union is saying, of course you can't do that because, you're hurting people. Likewise, and this is a specific example that John Stuart Mill had, that I can't stand outside Jonathan Ayling's house with an angry mob, right, and say, let's hang him, or let's burn his house down, right?
Yeah.
Because that's an incitement to violence. The crowd is angry, and they're likely to do that. And I am the one that's effectively hanging you or torching your house. Now, this is where it gets tough, right? Because the argument is you can't say speech that is harmful. But by harmful, we're meaning that directly, absolutely directly, burns your house down and sees you strung up or beaten. Because John Stuart Mill said that in another context, I could stand up at a public meeting and say that filthy Free Speech Union guy, he should be hung. Because there's no proximal harm being done. I'm not addressing the angry mob outside your house. And this, to me, is absolutely crucial, because if we don't draw that distinction of harm, then all hate speech can just get wrapped up in another harm, right? Is that how you see it?
That's exactly right. And that is exactly correct. And look, Rodney, this isn't hypothetical. This isn't us just assuming what maybe one day could happen. This is exactly what we see in every jurisdiction in the world that has implemented so-called hate speech laws that then are based around this notion of a subjective harm that is called often an emotional harm or something of that kind. They are always abused. And whether it's in Europe or in other countries and continents, we see that where, often with very good intentions, legislatures and leaders try to curtail what people are allowed to, what ideas they're allowed to speak about, it always gets abused. And going to this code, this NetSafe...
no, just stop there. I'm going to get to the code. I promise you, right?
I'm getting ahead of myself. I do apologize.
No, because you're so great. And you're not on a show that's going to cut you off. And if I do cut you off, I'll have you back, because I love getting my head around this. So what? And of course, there's another aspect to this, isn't there, Jonathan? That if you drive speech underground, you make it attractive. And it doesn't get criticised. One of the great things that happened to me while I was in Parliament was Sue Bradford got elected to Parliament. And you think, well, how could that be such a bad thing? Well, she was such a wonderful protester, and she had great lines, that she would stand out there on the barricades and you'd want to join in and go rah, rah, rah. But if she's giving a 10-minute speech on Clause 3 of some obscure act, actually she wasn't all that exciting, if you know what I mean. And there's nothing better than sunlight being that great disinfectant. And the danger that we have, and it might be a mad mullah, I'm all in favour of mad mullahs being able to have their say and saying how the West is Satan, Western people need to be driven from the face of the earth. I want them, if they think that, to say that, and to be safe in saying it, and to be criticised for that, and for it to be heard. Because if we say you can't say that, we drive it underground, we, funnily enough, make it attractive, we make it sort of, it's a bit like, having a cigarette and you're not supposed to when you're a kid, or swigging on a beer bottle. It's the fact that you
That's
can't
exactly right.
do it that makes it attractive.
As they say, stolen water tastes sweetest.
Yes. Stolen water tastes, that's a great line. I hadn't heard that. And it's the same, with what we call the far right. I want them to have their say because, frankly, when they have their say, they look stupid. But there's two elements at play here, Rodney, because you're absolutely right, and I want to really make sure that we're holding both of those. There is the aspect that prohibiting speech actually makes it more attractive. It drives it underground where it isn't exposed to other perspectives, and the error can't be revealed. But there's a second element of it as well, and I don't want us to miss it. It's that what you're saying is, if you hold it up to the sunlight, everyday Kiwis are actually mature enough and reasonable enough to make up their own minds. Yes.
And what we see with would-be censors is this fear that if you hold up speech that is incorrect or speech that is objectively harmful, of course, people saying drive them from the shores and that kind of thing is objectively harmful, but I believe most Kiwis look at it and go, rubbish. Whereas there's this fear, and it's very condescending, it's very diminutive of everyday Kiwis to go, you can't handle that. If you hear people spreading these ideas, you'll believe them because you're that gullible. And so that's why, for your own good, we need to make sure you don't hear these ideas.
And
so condescending.
We've had a specific example of that with the Brenton Tarrant Manifesto. Because to me, the worst thing you could do is ban his manifesto. Because as soon as you ban his manifesto, you put it underground, and I could take that to a young person who's very susceptible at 16, 17 and a bit lost, and you say, look, the authorities don't want you to read this, and they don't want you to read this because this is the truth. And as soon as you got that sense that the authorities don't want me to see this, oh, wow.
It's the one thing you want to read.
It's the one thing you want to read, and you don't see the criticism of it. All you've got is this person saying to you, this is so true, and it's so wonderful that you're not allowed to see it. My goodness, that's the start of a movement right there.
That's right, and this is a key point that unfortunately most of my generation doesn't understand. Last time I chatted with you on Monday, we discussed the role that the university has had in forming a generation that is quite antagonistic towards free speech, and it comes down to this idea of platforming. And when I was up at Auckland University of Technology last week running a union meeting there, and we had protesters outside, and quite happily afterwards I went out and spoke with them for an hour or so, and I was accused of all sorts of things, but really it was about platforming hateful individuals. And they brought up this example of Lawrence Southern and Stefan Molyneux, the speakers that were the beginning of the Free Speech Coalition, which preceded the Free Speech Union, these speakers that were cancelled up in Auckland. And we had this conversation, and I said, I had never heard of them in the past. Rodney, I don't know, had you heard of them before?
Never.
I had never heard of them before they were cancelled. And I would never have heard of them unless Phil Goff had done the very noble thing of making sure that they weren't platformed. And so now I am far more aware of the claims that they make than I ever would have been. And so it's this notion of platform. There's a term called the Streisand Effect there about Barbara Streisand, and some topless photos that I understand went round before my time. But a lot more people ended up seeing those photos when she tried to get them hidden than ever would have in the first place.
Yes.
And again, it's this notion that we can, not only can we, but we must control what people are exposed to for their own good and make sure that they only hear the ideas that are appropriate and they're acceptable. And I say, actually, there's something fundamentally anti-democratic about that. We all get to have a say in the speech that we find acceptable. And you know what? Some societies deem some ideas very acceptable that I find abhorrent. But what is why do I get to lord my perspective over them? It's a democratic value to go, actually, together we will have this debate, we'll let everyone come up with their own minds, and then we can move on together. And that's why I'm concerned. The Prime Minister keeps on talking about social cohesion. While she may have very good intentions in mind, I'm not going to comment on that. The reality is, you can often make these situations far worse by tinkering around the edges like this. And I worry that actually...
And that includes, for me, things...
I worry that our... Sorry, go ahead there, Rodney.
That includes things like, for me, like Holocaust denial. If someone wants to get up and say it didn't happen, they can. They won't be in my house saying that. They won't be on my show saying that because, they're talking nonsense. But I would never, ever try and shut them down. In fact, you'd want to expose them. In trying to shut them down, you're creating the problem and you're creating a sense of a conspiracy.
That's right. And it's because they are, someone who claims the Holocaust didn't occur. This is a good example. Just last week, we stood up for the right of an individual who has put a swastika on their car. And, people are going around saying we should ban the symbol. And that's a silly idea for many reasons, but not least of all because, those who would deny the Holocaust or who may even revel in it, it is demonstrably incorrect that the Holocaust didn't happen. And so I say demonstrate it. Rather than trying to push them down, simply let the truth and reality of the situation see the light of day. And I have confidence that most Kiwis and most people are actually willing to hear one side and then the other, and they actually are able to make their own minds up.
Wonderful. We've got all that as background because now we go across to what is, in many ways, the great democratization of the world, giving everyone a voice, allowing everyone to have a say. You can get online, you can create a blog, you can have a Facebook post, you can email anyone in the world that you like, you can put a tweet up, you can put a post. When that came along, I just thought it was the most wonderful thing imaginable because here you were, a politician trying to communicate to people, and you were travelling around, you're organising meetings, and suddenly it could all be done literally from the comfort of your own home, online, and all the rest of it. It, to me, has been amazing. I absolutely love it. And then you discovered in this process that it wasn't all sweetness and light, that there was some very, very nasty... I remember I had a blog. I had a blog before Mr. Farrar had a blog, and I was loving it. And then someone got on it, and they started writing very nasty stuff. And it actually affected me quite deeply because you'd sort of wake up in the morning and there'd be this message, and it would be this horrific message. And, I was a member of Parliament. I was like not a young person. But this person who was anonymous to me really started to affect my health. And because that someone could be literally on my computer, on my phone, sending such horrific, nasty messages. And, of course, this is the other side of it that we're trying to manage, that there's this dark stuff out there. It's not all... And you don't now just give out your email address or your phone number and, just text me or whatever. And so we come now to what you wanted to come on our show to talk about, this place called NetSafe. The platform, Jonathan, as they say, is yours. Tell us about it.
Well, thank you very much. The NetSafe, which is a non-governmental organisation, but which is primarily funded by government entities, the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Justice, is tasked with making sure that our online communications and content is appropriate in our society. And look, as you're saying there's a real dark underbelly of the internet, and no one can deny that. So what they've released, and it was a code that was drafted up till the end of last year. It went out for public consultation at the beginning of this year, and I'll come back to that. And it's just recently gone online, so to speak. It's called and it's a little bit long, so bear with me. The Aotearoa New Zealand Code of Practice for Online Safety and Harms. And they draft these things, it just rolls off your tongue, doesn't it? But
yes.
This code is a voluntary code for major platforms like Meta, which is Facebook, or Alphabet, Google, and that kind of thing. It's a voluntary code for them to sign up to that restricts them around 7 particular areas. And most of them are areas that, as we've discussed, are objectively harmful. Things like child sexual exploitation and abuse, or violence or graphic material, or bullying and harassment. These are things that there are standards for. They fall beyond the pale of free speech, and no one can reasonably defend them. But
and they would be, Jonathan, they'd be against the law now.
Well, you raised an interesting point there, Rodney. The Harmful Digital Communications Act and other pieces of legislation already outlaw things like these. So you do have to wonder exactly what this code is achieving. Already there's strong legislation in place that limits these demonstrably harmful materials. And so you do wonder if it's window dressing or a little bit of virtue signaling, because these are already illegal, as you point out. But what I'm concerned about is it strays into those more difficult and nuanced aspects that we've already discussed, things like misinformation and disinformation and hate speech. And it will require these platforms to remove content or posts that fall in these criteria, and it will allow others to flag this content as misinformation, so to speak, or as hate speech, and they will then have to review it and if they deem it as such, remove it. The problem is, in our mind, this gives a big stick to anyone who wants to beat down on ideas that they don't like. And we already see activist communities that go around harassing those that disagree with them and have no interest in debate, have no interest in free speech, simply want to shout down the other side and want to push them away. And so, there are many examples of this, but certainly the transgender question is one where portions of the rainbow community have said hashtag no debate. They are not willing for anyone to debate them on this. They're not willing for the conversation to be had. And so we are really concerned that mechanisms like this will be a big stick, where if someone, an example is Jordan Peterson, 2 weeks ago, banned from Twitter for saying something with regards to surgical, transitioning surgically. He said something that many thousands have also said on Twitter similarly, and yet he was the one that was removed. Why is that? We will see that there are these standards put in place, and how they get utilized is far from equitable. It in no way actually addresses the harm that is caused. It's often just pet projects that get picked up. And we're really concerned that it misses the point, that there is a dark underbelly, that we need to do more to address that. And as we've discussed, simply giving big sticks to people to push things away and push them underground, it's actually counterproductive.
Do you think that the people pushing this, and this may be a step too far for you, given your role, but do you think that there is a naivety or about what they're proposing? Because to you and me, it's as plain as the nose on our face how this is going to play out. And while you can pick obvious things that shouldn't be allowed, we know that it'll be used politically to shut down dissent. And we have witnessed that, and we have seen it, Jordan Peterson being a particularly famous example. But it is happening every day to people that we don't read about, and happening to serious academics, actually. So
right.
do you think that this is a naivety on the part of the people proposing this, or do you think it is actually a political agenda to shut down political debate?
Oh, look, Rodney, certainly for the majority of people, I would say it's an idealism. It's a hope that this would work. It's the belief that if we push away these bad influences enough, then people will flourish more. And again, I can't help but acknowledge that, of course, there is very harmful speech, and we have to be about the business of addressing that. But shutting down the debate actually causes more harm than helps it. But I want to take you up on that second aspect as well. While not a majority, I certainly do think that there are elements who want to co-opt our concern for the harm that's been caused to push a particular political perspective. And that's not conspiratorial. That is what has happened throughout history. I want to make that very clear, whether it be always political powers, but not always explicitly governments, often actually religious institutions that have been hyper-politicized as well, have always used what is the greater good and what is beneficial for society at large and all that. These very innocuous terms that can actually be very malignant, very pernicious. And, obvious examples are two individuals you may have heard of, Monsieur Galileo and Copernicus, who both were quite threatened for saying startling things like, actually, our Earth isn't the center of the universe. And that's challenged the religious order of the day. And I want to go back to what you were saying earlier about quote-unquote harmful speech. At one level, speech must be harmful. That's the entire point of speech. But what we want to do is not harm people. We want to harm ideas, and ideas that are incorrect specifically. The Catholic Church had a lot of harm done to it by teaching that the Earth was not the center of the universe. That was very harmful to the power structures of the day. It was very harmful to the way people saw the world. And I could use many examples of that. And that's why, to stop the harm, they suppressed that speech. And that is a necessarily political way of operating. And that's
why that concept of harm has to be so sharp.
That's right, absolutely. And very objective, because whether you like it or not, if you were in charge of defining what harm is, or what I was in charge of defining what harm was, we would still have some subjectivity come into it. And that's why it shouldn't just be left up to individuals or a net safe board or anything like that. Actually, we need very concrete objective tests, and beyond that, whether uncomfortable or unconventional or provocative, people should be damn well left to say what they like.
Well, here's what we've got to worry about, don't we? Because I happen to have been a great Trump supporter. I thought he was great. Now, I know that in New Zealand I'm probably a minority of one or two, but I'm happy to say that. I thought he was draining the swamp. But he was nonetheless the President of the United States. He was elected to that position. Twitter banned him.
Now that's an interesting example there, Michael, and I think it highlights the fact that...
You call me Michael, I'll be upset, I'll be hurt.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm used to having these fascinating conversations with Michael Lord Rodney. I think a lot of Kiwis would look at the example of Donald Trump and go, now that's getting pretty close to incitement of violence. But I think your point is true, that he was the President of the United States, despite whether the Silicon Valley corporations liked it or not. Actually, there should be a respect for what someone has to say there. But that kind of illustrates the point that everyone should get to have a say. But with the Trump example, he was removed from Twitter for inciting violence, allegedly, and I'm not claiming that, but I'm saying that was the reason used, and I think it highlights that this conversation is difficult, but that's why we need to stay clear of one-size-fits-all approaches that just fixes the problem and leads us into a safe nirvana. That's not reality.
It's not reality, and we've got this extraordinary situation where we've been through a COVID scare and pandemic, and whereby anyone that was suggesting something otherwise than what the government was doing was undermining public health messaging. You were like questioning what our troops were doing overseas and therefore unpatriotic.
Yeah.
So there was a higher good was invoked on speech. And so the media put it upon themselves not to allow dissent or debate because you couldn't undermine this health message. It had to be, we never had that level of censorship in World War II, actually, that operated through the COVID pandemic. You could still question our commitment and all the rest of it. And then we had, to me, the most remarkable thing to happen politically in New Zealand was the Prime Minister saying that if you wanted to know the truth...
She would be the single source of truth.
On COVID. Now, I would have expected at that point the journalists in the audience to fall over themselves, laughing their head off, right? Her to be mercilessly lampooned, right? And run out of office, actually, for saying it's gone to her head. And I know she was only saying she was a source of truth on COVID matters, not source of truth on everything. Mind you, we do question that too, right? But that becomes the standard, right? Now, this is horrific because the one thing you cannot allow is for the government to be the arbiter of speech and truth.
That's absolutely right. And that's why free speech is actually a very humble enterprise.
Absolutely.
It goes about saying, I could absolutely be incorrect. I don't think I am. That's why I'm saying what I'm saying. But it's possible I could be incorrect. Therefore, you need to be allowed to counter me. And I'm probably right, so I'll use my speech to prove that. But if I'm not, that will reveal the error of my ways. And there's a hubris, there's a profound arrogance in this belief that only one way of thinking must demonstrably be incorrect. Free speech is never a settled issue. It constantly evolves. And that's why no matter how long...
It's a funny thing, isn't it? Because it's a hubris, i.e. I am right, but immediately followed by a severe insecurity. Don't challenge me.
Touche, that's very true.
I mean, I think I'm right, and I love hearing people question me and query me and make me think, well, maybe I am wrong about that. I mean, that's the only way we can learn, isn't it?
Exactly, and that's why what we see emerging in universities, where actually questioning and challenging and debating is being put down, it bodes very poorly for the future stability of our sciences, or actually of any of the faculties there. If we can't challenge, we can't move knowledge forward. And a static society is not a healthy one.
Well, it's worth just reflecting on this, Jonathan, if I may, and we'll keep going with Facebook and NetSafe in a minute. But this is sort of leading up to getting there, is that I well remember I originally did environmental science and taught environmental science. And I can well remember when it was decided that climate change was settled. That climate change couldn't be discussed and debated. And it was counter your position in a university to question it. I couldn't believe that. And then we had the treaty, and it was the same thing. And then we had COVID. And you had very, very well-qualified, well-respected... you don't actually have to be well-qualified and well-respected to have free speech. But it wasn't just anyone being shut down. It was like anyone that questioned it was shut down. And now we're going to hand across to these tech giants, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and they're going to be guided by what standard to decide what is misinformation and disinformation. This has to be the most chilling thing you can imagine.
Exactly. And that's why I don't want to over-egg this, but we really do see it as one of the greatest threats to everyday Kiwis' speech currently being debated. You know, when the Minister of Justice released proposed hate speech laws, Kiwis resoundingly stood up and said, we do not need you to gag us or to control our speech. And that, you know, to the credit of the government, they have taken that on board to an extent, and we haven't seen those pursued actively to this stage. Of course, that's still pending. But I think it's questionable whether there is a mandate for organisations like NetSafe and others to be going around deciding what Kiwis should say. And we would always accept that private companies have the right to carry or not carry speech or content. But, you know, we were talking before about how the internet has opened up the ability to have a voice, and of course that is true. But it also means there are bigger controls over speech and over the platforms we use than ever before. You know, in the past, every city had their own newspaper, whereas now, whether we read different newspapers or not, we pretty much always access them on the same social media network. And so while it has opened up the ability to speech in many ways, it has also concentrated the power to restrict speech and content in greater ways. And, you know, we discussed the fact that I grew up overseas. I grew up in Mozambique. I was educated in Kenya. I've lived in Portugal, studied in France. I've spent a lot of time in different places around the world, and I watched with great interest when I was a teenager through the Arab Spring in 2011. And that was enabled through social media. That's kind of the illustration of what it could be, this great democratization of speech. But equally, do we think that would happen today with the controls that are emerging on these things and with the attempt of governments to shut down these mechanisms, whether it's through misinformation or disinformation or whether it's through hate speech laws or regulation? I'm very concerned that actually we're told what to think, we're told what to say, and we're not asked our opinions. And that's not going to be good for us no matter what the opinions are.
And I don't think it can be over-egged because it's that fundamental. And there's and I'd value your understanding of this, because it seems to me that Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it operate, dare I say it, under government license or with government support, because they're declared not to be responsible for the content they carry, correct?
Yes, at this stage.
So, just to explain that for everyone, I perfectly accept that the New Zealand Herald can decide not to carry a letter that I write to them because they own the newspaper. It's their newspaper. They can't stop me from starting my own newspaper or printing off a broadsheet and putting it, into letterboxes. They can't stop me doing that. That is my right for free speech. Now, the same argument is attempted to apply to, say, Facebook, because you say, well, Facebook is privately owned. Someone owns Facebook, and therefore that person that owns Facebook can decide what happens on Facebook, just like I can decide, or should be able to decide, what happens in my house or my business and what gets said and what doesn't get said. But there's a difference, because Facebook has a get-out-of-jail pass from the government to allow it to operate, which says you're not responsible for the content put on Facebook, which means that if I put something defamatory on Facebook, Facebook doesn't get sued as the publisher. Correct?
That's right.
Now, if that didn't exist, Facebook wouldn't be in business.
That's exactly right.
And that is...
And so what...
Sorry.
Genuinely, I think this is one of the most complex public policy questions I think we're looking to address at the moment, is how we integrate our ability to operate and to live in many ways, with the amount of time we spend online nowadays, to live in these virtual confines and what that means for things like the public square. It is very complex, and we don't want to pretend like it's simplistic, that if we just let everyone have the say no matter what, that we have our Nirvana. That's equally utopian. But and while we certainly accept that as private companies they can't be compelled to carry anything, there is more the cultural question or the philosophical question around what the implications are if we give such power to whether it be the platform itself, like Facebook, or whether it be a code and a board that overviews it.
Yes.
I think we see that while the answer isn't straightforward through legislation or regulation, the harm is nonetheless apparent, where we see that there will be abuses and politicization of those speeches. And so that's why we want people to be careful going forward. And we stand in good stead as the Free Speech Union with a number of different organizations who look at this code and who look at NetSafe and TechNZ, who are going to be administering it, and going, just be careful around this. Good intentions, you may do more harm than you ever intended. And we have Internet New Zealand, Andrew Cushion, the interim CE there, the Inclusive Aotearoa Collective, and Toha Toha New Zealand, three influential organizations that released a press release on Monday saying that they do not believe that this has been constructed, this code, in an inclusive way. And I think if we scratch below the surface, I don't want to be conspiratorial, but I know for a fact that the Facebooks and the Googles and the Twitters, their government relations departments, mostly based out of Singapore, have been very active in helping craft this code. And I don't know if they're the best people who we want defining what the limitations of Kiwi free speech is. NetSafe ran a consultation on this code, and over 4,600 Free Speech Union members supported against the code, endorsing it. And the basic premise of their submissions were, let legal speech be free speech. They're trying to ban speech that our parliament hasn't banned. They're trying to take down speech that is perfectly legal in this country. So let legal speech remain free speech. There were 20 submissions other than those that were endorsing the Free Speech Union. So there were 4,600 people that endorsed our submission and 20 other submissions that submitted at all. And yet virtually no changes were made to the code. And so NetSafe has gone out there and it's talked about an inclusive code that's built from the bottom up and has communities at the heart of it. But actually there's a real question about legitimacy here. And this code talks a lot about transparency, but transparency without accountability is just window dressing. And I'm really concerned that we actually see some of these bigger powers pulling the strings here, trying to maintain that privileged position that you were talking about before, Rodney, that these platforms have. And we feel like we're the ones limiting our own speech, and we're actually just puppets on a string.
And then that's why we agree it's extremely complex. It's not ready answers. And that's when you fall back on fundamental principles of living in a free society. And that's where the history of free speech, which was never an issue for me growing up because we didn't have this technological challenge to deal with. And the only way to deal with the technological challenge is not it's a whole new thing, we've got to invent the whole new wheel. No, you've got to go back to your principles, think about your principles.
Your core foundation.
Understand why they're important, and then how do you apply them to this tricky and difficult medium. And of course, it's very interesting to me too, because these big tech companies that have come out of nowhere relatively in terms of time, it's not the case that you can necessarily just come along and start a new free Facebook, because you've actually got to get the bandwidth, you've got to get the servers. And these guys actually control that too, right?
That's right. And Rodney, that's why the Free Speech Union, we always talk about the fact that we're non-partisan, and that is true. We discussed on Monday, free speech is not a left-right political issue. But at a certain level, free speech is partisan. It divides over those who are freedom-loving and believe in the right of individuals to have liberty, and those that are authoritarian and believe in the right of the group to compel individuals. And going back to that foundation, look at societies around the world that have flourished, that have led to stability, peace, and prosperity. And, as I said, I spent a lot of time overseas. Very few individuals, beyond you and me and other Kiwis today, have known the peace and prosperity and stability that we enjoy in New Zealand right now. But the reason because of this is because we've believed in the liberty of individuals to go about living their lives. And certainly there are constraints on that. There has to be. But it runs counter to this idea that we can force people into their best life. That is not the case. And
No.
Jacob Nchangama, who is a Danish advocate for free speech, a very prominent individual in Europe, and he's going to be coming down here for our Free Speech Union AGM in November, a little plug for you there. But he wrote a book, Free Speech, A History, and in it he unpacks free speech is not just a Western idea either. There are many examples of other nations around India and through, the early Muslim caliphs and that kind of thing that really believed in free speech. And in every single one of those cases, it's led to the prospering of that society. And that's why, coming full circle in a way here, I'm very concerned for the direction that we're heading. And I want to kind of draw in that other conversation that Michael Laws had with Meng Foon the other day around this code that he has released for local councillors. And he claims that to oppose co-governance is necessarily racist. and it's those sort of comments that shut down political debate.
Well, he's a scoundrel. He's actually a scoundrel, because I know Meng Foon, I know him well, I remember, I met him many times, but that is the, what is it? It is the actions of a scoundrel to take a position and then to declare anyone that questions my position as immoral, right?
That's absolutely correct.
That is a scoundrel. That is a person who's not prepared to debate. That is a person that says, my ideas are high and mighty. That is a guy bereft of integrity, and I'm afraid we see it nowadays over and over and over, and ultimately it's just disrespectful. Because it's
and it's fundamentally anti-democratic.
Absolutely.
And in this code, they define bullying and harassment as, quote, requiring some kind of power imbalance between the people involved, which fundamentally then seems to give different people different rights. If you tick the right box that you are, quote unquote, disempowered for whatever reason, and I think you know what reasons we use in society at the moment, then anyone who's disagreeing with you is bullying and harassing you. But if you are, quote unquote, empowered, and we have an idea of the people that are supposedly empowered in our society, then nothing anyone says against you could be bullying or harassment. This is what creates different tiers of citizens, and it has not once worked for the peace or prosperity of a nation. And so that's why
Meng Foon's got his own little podium there of truth.
That's right. He's got his own soapbox that he's preaching off. And
I wish I had one of those. One of the things.
Now I'm thankful.
One of the things
I'm thankful for opportunities like this. With the platform, it is a new day for those who will disagree with the countervailing perspective. And so I'm glad we're able to have discussions like this, because there's not many other people that are interested in sponsoring them. One
of the things that's interesting to me too is that how free speech operates culturally, not within the law and being polite. And it's very interesting that, they had, I think it was the Korean Airlines, they used to crash their planes at an inordinate degree. They weren't safe. And I think it was Korean, I might have that wrong. And it was one Asian country's airlines, and they did everything, and they couldn't figure it out. And it was because culturally, a co-pilot couldn't question the pilot. And we'd think nothing of it. And they would literally fly to their death because the pilot had set the course and you couldn't say, I think you've made a mistake. And then likewise, there's been a great analysis. I'm a bit of a military buff. I've never been a soldier or sailor or an airman, but it fascinates me. And that troops that can show initiative and question the sergeant and question the major. It's not just the Western forces fighting the Nazis. Could actually operate with a degree of autonomy. They mightn't be able to question the orders, but when they were given the orders, they could sort of say, "Hey, Sarge, what say we try this?" And that made them so much more successful than those whom they were fighting against. And it's such a fascinating thing. That it's that true diversity of thought, of speech, and of course, to me, you can't think properly unless you can speak freely, and you can't speak freely and critically if you can't write freely. All those things are necessary to sort out your ideas. And, you start thinking something and you think, I'm not sure I've got that right. I'm not sure I got that right. And you have to go and sort of chat about it, toss it up on Facebook, get some feedback, talk to Jonathan on the platform, listen into the show, test that idea, ring in. That's the way your thoughts develop and become enhanced.
That's right.
And that necessitates free speech.
That's right. And it comes back to that humility of all of us participating in the process of developing understanding and knowledge. And I think there's something, you were talking before about soldiers that participate in the fight going forward. And I look at the Kiwi way, and I'm proud of the ingenuity and the innovation that Kiwis are known for. And it's because we're willing to try something. And it may work, it might not work, but let's give it a go. Let's put an idea out there, and if it gets knocked down, well, that one wasn't the right one. But we'll give it a go. And I'm worried that more and more people in our society self-censor every day. It's one of the great travesties, I think, of our time. One of the great impoverishing factors is people that are too afraid to put an idea out there because we become very vitriolic. And that is, that's what
Jonathan,
a lot of people on the other side would call harmful speech.
Jonathan,
but we need to...
Jonathan, I love having you on. I'm going to have you on again because you're just such a wonderful enthusiast.